Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Using Technology to Address Food Availability. I'm Erica Logan, Senior Manager for Technology Assessment and Resource Development at the Global Electronics Council. I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. This is our second in a series of 3 calendar year 2021 webinars highlighting new and important ways that technology is conserving and protecting our natural world. It is also closely aligned with GEC's Catalyst Awards program, which recognizes innovations in technology that advance sustainability globally. This year's Catalyst Awards theme is similarly focused on innovative uses of technology for conservation. Today's webinar features 3 presenters whom I will introduce in a moment, 4 presenters actually. But first, a few reminders. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website for people who are unable to join live and for sharing with your colleagues. Also, we are looking forward to a robust Q&A session at the end of the presentations. We encourage you to submit questions by typing them into the questions window. We'll get to as many as possible once the final speaker has completed their presentation. And as a reminder, all attendee lines have been muted. Starting our discussion will be Ms. Nancy Gillis, CEO of the Global Electronics Council. She will be followed by, excuse me, I got an order thing here, Dr. Louise Amaral, Director, Solutions for Commodities and Finance with the World Resources Institute. He will be followed by Dr. Scott Shearer, Professor and Chair of Food, Agricultural, and Biological Engineering at Ohio State University. And we'll conclude with Mr. Berhain Gabrou, Technical Advisor for Digital Technology at FHI 360 Tech Lab. So let us begin. Nancy Gillis is CEO of the Global Electronics Council. Nancy has more than 20 years of experience leveraging sustainability to increase competitiveness, reduce risk, and foster innovation in the public and private sector. Before joining GEC, Nancy was a senior executive with Ernst & Young, where she managed client engagements related to supply chain resiliency and sustainable procurement for Fortune 100 companies. She also launched and served as global lead for Ernst & Young's Resilient and Responsible Supply Chain suite of services. Nancy joined Ernst & Young from the U.S. General Services Administration, where she was responsible for developing sustainability-related supplier evaluation criteria and expanding the use of sustainability standards in federal procurements. Nancy?
Great. Thank you very much, Erica, and thank you to all of the speakers who are joining us today. As was introduced, I'm Nancy Gillis. I'm the CEO of the Global Electronics Council. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you and give you a quick overview of the Global Electronics Council for those of you who may not know who we are. So next slide, please. The Global Electronics Council, we're actually a mission-driven nonprofit organization. We've been in existence for more than a decade. And as you can see from the slide, what we're really focused on is creating a more sustainable and just world. And the way that we seek to achieve that more sustainable and just world is to leverage the power of institutional purchasers. So you frequently see us actually in the technology space helping those purchasers, public and private sector, to buy credible, sustainable permutations of their technology products or services. And we really believe that technology plays a fundamental role in making the world more sustainable and just. And not only by being more sustainable technology and services based on technology, but also the role that technology plays in other ways. And of course, this webinar is to explore some of those other ways. Now, I do mention that we are a nonprofit and we leverage institutional purchasing power. The way that we do it is we provide purchasers, public and private sector, with a number of tools. So before we get into the content of today's webinar, let me share with you a little bit about what else you can get from our organization. Next slide. So as I mentioned, our mission is really to help large-scale purchasers buy sustainable technology products and services as a way to incentivize the producers to make them. And the way that we help institutional purchasers is through a number of freely available tools and resources. One of the best ones that we're known for is our management of the ecolabel called EPEAT, E-P-E-A-T. This is the most used ecolabel for technology products globally. And we're very proud to be the managers. And if you're in the market, especially a large-scale purchaser, and you're wanting to buy lots of sustainable IT products, such as televisions or notebooks, laptops, mobile phones, servers, EPEAT covers those. And by buying an EPEAT registered technology, what you can feel comfortable with is that you're buying a credibly sustainable one. But we don't only manage the EPEAT ecolabel. We also provide purchasers with examples of how to implement successful and effective procurement policies that make the procurement programs that organizations run more impactful. And we also provide training. And of course, we also provide purchaser guides. All of these resources are available on our website, which is www.globalelectronicscouncil.org. Next slide. Now, for the purchasers who are interested, as I mentioned, we do manage the EPEAT ecolabel, and here you just quickly see a lot of the product categories that the ecolabel covers. And what I'm very proud to say is that we're actually launching 2 new product categories: network infrastructure, that really looks at sustainability, not just of the technology in your work environment. Many of us, of course, are sitting in our home offices, participating here, using a laptop and so forth. But what really makes that connectivity sustainable? Well, network equipment. But also, we are launching an initiative to bring sustainability to health and well-being wearables. And of course, as we lived through a last year of COVID and are still grappling with that horrible virus, the importance of wearables to maintaining our health and well-being cannot be overstated. And so we're very proud to actually be launching a category that brings credible, sustainable wearables used for health and well-being purposes to institutional purchasers globally. But again, moving on, today we are talking about food and the role that technology plays in addressing food scarcity. And you may be wondering, why is the Global Electronics Council hosting this webinar? Well, as I mentioned, we believe in the power of technology, and not only making technology in and of itself more sustainable through the leveraging of institutional purchasing power, but we also understand the very valuable role that technology plays in making other aspects of our world sustainable and just. And so one of the things that we focused on a lot for this particular webinar series is what does technology provide to biodiversity conservation? And of course, biodiversity is also important to food. And so here in today's webinars, what we're very interested in hearing from our very esteemed panel of speakers is we're looking at this incredibly large portion of the planet being used for crops. And crops, of course, using a lot of water. And all of those crops using a lot of water and land space need to be able to get from where they're grown to where we buy them. So what's the role of technology to make this entire process of both the growth of foodstuffs as well as its transportation more efficient and more equitable? And then how does technology actually address the tremendous amount of food loss and waste that happens before food ever gets to us, to the marketplace? A loss that I think many individuals aren't even aware of. And then lastly, what we're also very interested in, and we're looking forward to your guidance and insights, is how does access to data help in addressing food availability and making sure that food sources are not an undue draw on other resources? And how do we make sure that everybody who needs access to the data, such as farmers, get access to that data? So these are some of the questions that we're very interested in, and we know that those who are participating in today's webinar are as well. And we look forward to the presentations from all of you on answering some of those questions. So again, thank you very much from the Global Electronics Council, and thank you to all of you who are dialing in today and listening in. And thank you very much to Erica, our facilitator for today's webinar. With that, let me step aside. Erica?
Thanks so much, Nancy. Thank you for providing that overview of GEC and setting the stage for what I know is going to be a very informative discussion. So let me move to our next speaker. Our next presenter is Dr. Louise Amaral. Dr. Amaral is the Director, Global Solutions for Commodities and Finance at the World Resources Institute. He also leads product development for WRI's Global Forest Watch and serves on the Credit Committee of Green Fund, an impact investment facility supporting sustainable agriculture. Previously, Dr. Amaral was the head of sustainability for Rabobank in South America. He also served on the Sustainability Council of the Brazilian Federation of Banks and on the board of the Brazilian National Fund for Climate Change, Fundo Clima. He holds a master's degree in international economics from Institut d'études politiques de Paris and a PhD from the University of São Paulo, where he worked on the impacts of information technology on sustainable rural development. A former recipient of the United States Department of Agriculture Fellowship on Agriculture and Climate Change, he has authored several research studies and op-eds on sustainability, finance, and rural development. Dr. Amaral, over to you.
Well, Erica, thank you so much. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here presenting and discussing with such a great panel. So I'll jump right into it. Thanks again for the invitation, and it's a pleasure. So let's see if this slide is coming through. Next slide, yes, this one. So, I'll discuss here today a little bit. We're discussing a little bit of the impacts of technology on rural development and food availability. I just wanted to start with this slide because most of the presentation is go through this vision that we have at WRI that we really have to measure in order to manage, right? That our strategy on WRI is try to count it, change, and scale solutions for sustainable development globally. And it's no different from food and agri food and agri production. So that will be the tone of the presentation. The other thing that is going to be the tone of the presentation is that agriculture has traditionally been an activity which was a lot based on on previous knowledge and experience from farmers. So you do whatever your fathers and grandfathers taught you. But with increasing availability of data thanks to technology, more and more it's a trend that in agriculture, just as in any other sector in our lives, those decisions are being more based on data-based decisions rather than your necessarily previous knowledge. So more and more you're moving from what we know how things are being done to what should have been done based on availability of data. But more than that, it's very likely that this is going to be a disruptive process, not something that's going to slowly come, but something that's going to come and all of a sudden really change the way we do things in this sector. So here's a little bit of the agenda today with that in mind. First, I'll just give you a little bit quick context on what are the key global environmental challenges for more sustainable foods. Then I'm going to discuss what does it all mean, how we bring technology for production of this food and for supply chains. And I'll just end the conversation with a big question for us. So getting started, as it was already mentioned, one of our key challenges in agriculture is that land is a limited resource globally, and already more of the land mass is already occupied by agriculture. And more important than that, as population and diet shifts change, that number of land occupied by agriculture is increasing significantly over time. So we have limited resources which are being more and more demanded on the land side. And that causes several issues. One of them, for example, is deforestation, which makes agriculture being representing around 23% of all of our global greenhouse gas emissions because of that land use change. If you include other activities on the food system, including transportation, etc., the food and agri system represent about 37% of all of our emissions globally. So land use in agriculture is both a powerful emitter, but it can also be an important sink of carbon. Just so you know, land sequestered globally more or less the amount of emissions that the United States does every year. So preserving those areas and restoring those areas is a big opportunity as well. The other key thing, the other key impact on agriculture is water, right? For water usage, it's not, I mean, we do need to eat, so there's no way that we cannot do that without water, but it's important to recognize that, that agriculture represents about 69% of the waters we draw in the globe. So it's another one of the other key impacts. But more than that, it's also subject to risks. Half of the cotton and wheats produced globally are actually in water stress areas. So they're not only, it's not only they're demanding resources, but sometimes they're subject to resource scarcity risks. And 1/3 of corn, rice, orange, and cane are also in very water distressed areas. The final challenges are that 1/3 of food is produced globally is lost and wasted. So we're using all of those resources to produce this food, but see, 1/3 of this thing is just lost. So there's a big potential for us increasing that, reducing that loss, and therefore reducing the pressure that we have on our resources. And the other important thing to know is that that happens very different in different parts of the globe. So if you compare, for example, what is the food and loss portfolio in North America and Oceania, compared to sub-Saharan Africa, whereas in North America and Oceania, the biggest part of the waste happens at consumption level. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's actually at the very beginning of the supply chain, it's on the production and handling. So there are different strategies to tackle this issue, depending on where you are in the globe. And finally, then moving to the next step then. So what does it all mean for a more sustainable production, right? I think the first thing that we need to recognize is that the future of agriculture, we have for 10,000 years simplified agricultural processes, right? When we first started this, we just need to have better varieties, eliminate pests from the fields, and just trying to get as standardized as we could to really boost productivity and increase our food security. But the future of agriculture is moving from a simplification into a complexity, into bringing more and more variables to that activity. So if before farmers were just a farmer that had to take care of producing its own products, now they're much more of a land resource manager. They have not only to produce something, but they have to be able to deal with complex integrated systems in which you're producing different crops in the same place. You have to watch for financial risks, for other risks that happen. So this increased complexity on the activity is one of the key challenges why data-driven information becomes even more important. That's why bringing technology to help with this more complex agricultural world is going to be key for success, long-term sustainability of this sector. What are the barriers for that to happen? Well, the first one is that there's still a digital divide for us to really make that potential happen. And in my vision, it has changed a little bit for what it was before. Before, when we discussed digital divide, was a poor, rich type of discussion on whether some had access to devices and hardware and others had not. These days, the digital divide, it's more of, in my opinion, an urban versus rural type of a thing. If it doesn't matter if you're in a rich country or a poor country, if you go to the big urban centers, there's a lot of access to technology, but as we move down into the rural areas, that's when those types of things start to become more difficult. And here's just an example of internet coverage, 3G internet coverage in Brazil and Ghana, and you can see big cities have coverage, whereas rural areas does not. The other challenge is that now with a wealth of data, it's just not availability of data that will make this thing possible. The other key role that technology has is translating that data into insights, right? We have not just to get the data, but we have to make the data into something that is usable and useful for the actors that we're trying to influentiate. So starting to conclude, what does it all mean then to more sustainable supply chains as well? So one thing is that because of this availability of the data, because of this technology development, supply chains are increasingly being more subject to scrutiny and transparency, and that's not different for agricultural supply chains. And that is going to change the way food and agri is produced and traded globally. And here's an example of the project that I work on, which is called Global Force Watch, in which for the first time, we're able to measure at a global level on a weekly basis to see where trees are disappearing. So it doesn't matter if you're in Canada or Uganda, you can see where trees are disappearing on areas of 30 by 30 meter resolution. And the key benefit here is that it's leveraging satellite and big data to train the computer to identify those for us. Nobody can look at the whole world, but technology is allowing us to really focus on the areas that matter. And a little merchandise here, I just invite you all to visit globalforestwatch.org and our pro.globalforestwatch.org, which is a tool and a technology that we developed specifically for the private sector to manage the deforestation risks on their supply chains. Again, pro.globalforestwatch.org. We have more than 100 companies now that monitor thousands of areas globally to see where the areas they're buying from that are subject to risks of deforestation. And they go from big multinationals such as Unilever or Mondelez to trading companies such as Olam and Cargill, all the way down to, for example, most of the Paraguayan finance sector also uses that system to mitigate their risk. And it's not just about deforestation. Advances are being made to really monitor land use and agriculture at a global level, which has never done before. Here, for example, is a map of which we're now capable of doing, of measuring soy production everywhere in Latin America every year. So you can see, again, the same way you see forests, you can see where soy is produced and being planted in all of South America every year. And it's not just us. There are partners that are doing similar things. So I also invite you to invite these partners website, which is called trace.earth, which they're not tracing what's happening on the ground, but they're tracing what the flows of agricultural inputs are happening globally. So you can actually pick a company. For example, in this case, we're looking at Bunge's buying footprints of soy in Brazil and what is ending up. And we can see that most of Bunge's selling is ending up in China. So this level of scrutiny and transparency is going to completely shift the way companies and actors are subject and are working on their agricultural supply chains. And this shift is really going to change the way businesses are done, risks are managed, and hopefully it'll also change a little bit of the impacts that farmers can have, or the benefits that farmers can harvest out of this process. So one of the key challenges that farmers' margins tend to be reduced as we commoditize, right? Because commodities are by definition low margin products. As these markets start to integrate and eventually you can have better connections between the end consumer and the farmer producing, there's an opportunity that the benefits from the consumer can more easily be transferred to the farmers, which had been a challenge and very, very hard to achieve in the past without technology. So to conclude, the big question that I have is, if we are in a data age, a data and transparency age, in which our decisions are data-driven and transparency is the norm, in which complexity is the new normal, so going from simplicity to very sophisticated and complex systems in food and agri, and if supply chains are going to be reorganizing thanks to technology as well, the key question then is, are we going to experience the end of commodities? Are all of these technological advances really being able to us to finally differentiate products which are traditionally seen as same, and therefore being priced differently, having different market avenues for that, and therefore having different benefits for the producers of these products? So are we going to be able to differentiate corn that is produced in the US Midwest to a corn that is produced in Western Europe to a corn that is produced in North Argentina, and therefore creating those different markets? It was not possible before because it was very important to create those commodity markets for efficiency. It was impossible to compete, but technology might allow us now to really start creating those differentiated commodity markets based on their sustainability performance. So I'll stop here. And again, it was a pleasure, and I look forward to continue the discussion.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Luis. I imagine during the Q&A portion, we'll be discussing that question more so. Looking forward to it. I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, who is Dr. Scott Shearer. Dr. Shearer serves as professor and chair of food, agricultural, and biological engineering at Ohio State University. Highlights of his research career include development of methodologies and controls for metering and spatial applying of crop production inputs, modeling of agricultural feed machinery systems, autonomous multi-vehicle field production systems, and strategies for deployment of unmanned aerial vehicles in agriculture. He has led research supported by over 12 million in grants, authored more than 200 technical publications, and has made numerous invited presentations at international conferences, professional meetings, and farmer forums. Dr. Shearer is a fellow of the American Society of Agricultural and Biological Engineers. He received his PhD in agricultural engineering from OSU in 1986. Dr. Shearer, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Erica. And again, I'm pleased to be here today and look forward to talking a little bit about technology at the farm level. And so we'll go ahead and get started here. One of the things that I think a lot of people realize, and the previous speaker alluded to, is data is driving a lot of what we do in agriculture today. One of the things that I always start out in talking to groups about is to give them a feel for how much data is being generated. Here in North America right now, and this would be typical of other places in the world as well, we're generating about a .5 kilobyte per corn plant per growing season. What does that really mean? And to put it in terms that a lot of people can begin to appreciate is, that's like 1 hectare of crops, if you will, sending you 25,000 email messages during the growing season telling you how it's doing. Now, with the technology we have today, we can actually track the location of almost every seed that we're putting in the ground. We also have opportunities to sense soil strength, if you will, compaction zones, and a number of other features going on. We're starting to see densification. The Internet of Things obviously has its role in agriculture. There was a comment made by the last presenter about the digital divide and internet connectivity in rural parts, but we're starting to see densification of weather stations, densification of sensors that are in situ and giving us soil fertility levels as well as moisture levels in the soil. And the upshoot of this is it's helping us do a much better job of managing inputs in comparison to days gone by. A lot of data going into the data warehouses, at least in North America, obviously is coming from agriculture, and we'll see that increasing role as time goes along. Today, when a farmer enters the field, starts the tractor, it's connected to the internet and data is flowing. Data is flowing into the repositories, if you will, and it's being made available for aggregation to a number of organizations. I'm not endorsing anyone's product here. I just want everybody to understand the breadth of what's going on in many places in the world today. I mentioned the fact that we have this digital divide. We have it here in North America, and we look at rural parts of our country, and the question is are we going to get broadband internet? A number of competing technologies. Obviously, time will tell in terms of which wins out. But right now, one of the major constraints on development of agriculture, continuing development of agriculture, is going to be broadband in these rural areas. Unmanned aerial systems are going to change the way we view data generation. I mentioned before the 25,000 email messages per hectare per year, if you want to think of it that context. Once the FAA kind of takes the brakes off, so to speak, on unmanned aerial systems under 400 feet, we begin flying autonomously, we think there's going to be a 10-fold increase in data generation. So that 25,000 email messages per hectare per year goes to 250,000 pretty quickly. And so that is the rate at which data is going to increase in terms of agricultural production. Some things we've been doing at Ohio State, we're looking at using artificial intelligence as a method of assessing crop stress. We're getting some pretty phenomenal results, but we're just kind of on the cusp of beginning to apply artificial intelligence to these large volumes of data that are coming out of agriculture right now. In some respects, when we think about artificial intelligence and its application, the question is, who's the aggregators and who's going to be training those models that are being applied. This is just an example, and I want to point out left-hand side image over here. Nitrogen deficiency occurs at generally the lower leaves of the corn plant. If we're sensing from above, remote sensing in a lot of cases, we may be doing a post-mortem on nutrient deficiencies in a crop. If we can detect those nutrient deficiencies early on at the lower portion of the canopy, we have a much better job of much better opportunity to apply a rescue N application and conserve or minimize yield loss. But again, our ability to use artificial intelligence to analyze these images, we're just on the cusp of it, but some amazing things are beginning to happen. This is some work we've been doing at Ohio State, again, in trying to map weed infestations. We know there's a lot of technologies that are occurring when we look at genetically modified organisms, some of the resistant weeds that are occurring. We know that things are going to change markedly in terms of how we manage our herbicides. This is some of the work we've been doing in the field in terms of the artificial intelligence, training the neural network classifiers, and then being able to upload those very quickly to the unmanned aerial systems. The other thing that I'm going to characterize that we're seeing today is what I call robot proliferation in agriculture. There's a lot of high horsepower, high capital cost equipment today in agriculture. I think when we're able to remove the human operator from this equipment, we go back to a much smaller scale and in some cases much less expensive. This is Agco's Xavier. This is a swarm robot, if you will. Very small machine, but this plants a single row of crops. And so we're going to see, once we're able to take the operator off the piece of equipment, we're going to see the size of the equipment change markedly. I want to emphasize the fact that one of our major soil health problems in a lot of these intense agricultural regions right now is the physical size of the equipment. When you have a 600 horse tractor, you have to have the weight to take advantage of that horsepower. We also see harvesting equipment getting very large. This is Swarm Farm, a company out of Australia. There are a couple companies that I'm watching very closely, but they're developing swarms of autonomous sprayers. In this case, their ground is fallow, but what they're doing is they're conserving use of herbicides by spot spraying with technologies on these autonomous robots. What we're seeing is also a reduction in cost for spray application. In this case, we're seeing about 10 cents on the dollar in terms of what farmers might be spending in North America. The company, in this case, Swarm Farm, is actually leasing the equipment to farmers. And so when we look at capitalization of agriculture, I think we're going to see a shift from the demand of large sums of capital in some cases to farming as a service. And so be looking for how this kind of works out as we go forward. This is a company out of the central part of the U.S. I want to emphasize that they have removed the operator from the tractor. They're using much smaller pieces of equipment. And there's a video here if I can get actuated. But they've been doing this for farming as a service. And so it's no longer necessarily an expectation that a farmer is going to own all the equipment and or the farmer is going to be operating the equipment in some cases. I think we're going to see a significant increase in farming as a service. And I think Sabanto is one of those companies that's a pretty good example of that. As we continue to move on, there's a lot of things coming in terms of weed control. And again, what this boils down to is, can we more effectively utilize our resources? This is a company by the name of Echo Robotics. Oh, sorry about that. Maybe I don't know whether I can get this there. Maybe I can get this to play. But this is basically a sprayer. It's using micro sprays. It's using artificial intelligence to locate the weeds, distinguish those from the crop. And the other thing is this is using photovoltaics. And so again, it's solar powered. Those are micro sprays. We're seeing a substantial reduction in the amount of herbicide necessary to control weeds in a lot of crops. This is some technology out of the Silicon Valley, California, Blue River. It was purchased by a company that most people will recognize if you've been around agricultural equipment, but John Deere. And this company, again, is doing some rather unique things in that with their technology, their vision technology, they're able to look at plants, discriminate weeds from plants, and then with very accurate application of the herbicide, spray only the weeds. The upshoot of this is they report in some cases a 90 to 95% reduction in the amount of herbicide being used to control, in this case, weeds in cotton. John Deere is transitioning that technology for agricultural crop production in I'm going to say the broadacre crops, the corn and soybean type crops in the central part of the U.S. So it's going to be exciting to watch this technology roll out and to think what it's going to mean to agriculture. And in some cases, we're going to be replacing some of the chemicals that have traditionally been used in agriculture with technologies that alter our ability to control populations. This is another technology I think we need to pay a little bit of attention to. A lot of people have thought about genetically modified crops, thought about maybe the petrochemical industry and some of the herbicides that have come out of that. But this is a company, Zaso, that has actually been using electrical current and high voltage potential as a way of controlling weeds. Now, there's some challenges with this in terms of some of the technology, but essentially electrodes coming in contact with the weeds, you do have to raise the temperature in some respects of the weed, and there's a little bit of a problem with moisture content in some cases. But again, a different technology for managing weeds in some of these agricultural production fields. The other thing that I'm going to mention is when I was talking about unmanned aerial systems before, or drones, I was mostly focusing on the use of those in sensing. We see Velodrone, a company out of Germany, again partnering with John Deere, and they're beginning to use these for spray application. So again, when we begin combining our ability to make multiple passes over the field to sense and make a determination as to how we're going to use whatever control agent might be there, the upshoot of this is we're going to be much more efficient, much more productive in terms of controlling what's going on in our crops. At Ohio State University, we routinely report on these technologies and how farmers are using those, and I'll encourage everyone to download our eFields report to see some of what we're doing at Ohio State in terms of integration of technology into agricultural production. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to Erica. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. It's really fascinating. I'm seeing a bunch of questions coming in about the technology and where it's going, and cost, economics, and barriers to entry, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that as soon as we complete our presentation. So thank you so much. With that, let me move on to our final speaker. I'm pleased to be able to introduce Mr. Berhane Gebru. Mr. Gebru is a technical advisor for digital technology at FHI 360. He's an expert in climate change adaptation and digital technology with over 18 years of experience developing, managing, and implementing global, regional, and country-level programs that employ innovative technology to solve development challenges. Over the past 18 years, he successfully led more than 70 projects in 40 countries involving the development and deployment of digital technologies to improve adaptation action to the impacts of climate change, strengthen health and education systems, build the entrepreneurial capacity of individuals and small businesses, and increase the efficiency and cost effectiveness of electronic data collection and analysis. He has been involved as a negotiator in the climate change negotiation processes of the Conference of Parties under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and its Kyoto Protocol. Mr. Gebru, over to you.
Thank you very much, Erica. Great to be here, and I thank for inviting me to participate in this great panel. I will be, Dr. Shearer gave a very interesting presentation, as did Louise, and I'll take you from a more of precision agriculture that Dr. Shearer presented to a more of traditional kind of use of technology at farm level for subsistence farmers. This is a case in Uganda and Kenya, a project implemented in Uganda and Kenya for supporting subsistence and small-scale farmers to adapt to the impacts of climate change and also to increase their productivity by providing some relevant information through different channels. So to give you a quick background about the kind of problems that this initiative addresses, the subsistence farmers, they rely on rainfall for crop production, and the availability of rainfall is highly impacted by climate change. So the intensity and frequency of drought and flooding has increased in both countries, as it did in most of sub-Saharan countries. In addition, there is unpredictability of rainfall, especially on the onset and cessation of rainfall. And there was a recent survey that was done. Over 93% of the developing countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, express the need for climate and agriculture related information. So the project tries to address this need of these small scale farmers in Uganda and Kenya. So there was a household survey that we did in terms of their current access to information to help them make farm decisions. Nearly 50% of the farmers had access, but what is striking is that over 86% of the farmers do not trust the information that they have received. And some of the reasons are maybe it's because the information is not localized to their parish or to their village, or the information sometimes it's in addition to being generic, they might be receiving it after the season has started, so that it's no more useful for making farm decision. So to address this, we've been providing hyper-local climate and agricultural information, which is localized to sub-county or parish level, depending on the agroecological zoning of the farms. And there are three types of information that we provide to the farmers. First, in terms of climate and weather forecasters, seasonal forecasters, which are delivered 1 month before the start of the season, and 1 month forecasters and 10-day weather forecasters that are localized to sub-county or parish level. We also provide agricultural advisories in 4 areas that would help farmers make farm decisions. So to help them select the right crop varieties for the season, when to plant, or do they dry plant, or do they make a delayed plant? Do they do the planting after the season has started? In terms of water management practices, what type of water harvesting measures they need to take considering the season, and soil fertility management options about types of fertilizers to use. Do they use manure? Do they use combine? Or maybe they don't use fertilizer at all. So depending on the seasonal forecasts, we provide such agricultural advisories. And we also provide market information for crops, livestock, and agricultural inputs to help the farmers decide what to buy, when to buy it, or when to sell, so at competitive rates. So we use multiple dissemination channels. We use digital technology like text messaging, interactive voice response, especially for illiterate people. They prefer to have the interactive voice response. We use email. We use web content. We also use the more traditional technology like radio broadcasters. So radio is very, very much in use in most of sub-Saharan countries, and we use that. We also use the traditional methods like posters and, of course, face-to-face meetings between extension agents and the farmers. So the use of multiple dissemination channels enables us to expand our reach to more farmers depending on the availability of, their access to different technology and also their preferences. So far we are reaching over 300,000 farmers who are receiving climate and agricultural information using the different channels. And we conducted, as part of this initiative, we have a controlled study that involves treatment group and also a control group. So 3 in 4, that is about 75% of those who received the information have applied it into action, and over 90% of them have found it useful and effective for crop production. In terms of impact, as I said, we have a controlled study where we have treatment districts that receive information and also control districts that do not receive information from this initiative. And it has been done on multiple time points since 2012 up to the last one that we have collected is in 2020 last year, over multiple time pointers. So it has resulted in an increase of farmers' crop production by 65%, and obviously it contributes to the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically on the 3, in terms of no poverty, zero hunger, and on improving climate actions. So at this time, we are looking into the different scaling up pathways using a policy pathway where, integrating or institutionalizing this approach with government entities, and also using a market-based pathway where small businesses would be integrating the provision of such services to the farmers in a sustainable way. For example, there could be off-takers who would integrate the delivery of such information to the farmers as part of their agreement with the small-scale farmers. Yeah, I think this is my last slide. Thank you, and I want to acknowledge the partners who are involved in the implementation of this project. Thank you.
Berhane, thank you so much. Thank you for taking us to Kenya and Uganda with you and helping us appreciate the hyperlocality of climate change and feeding the most vulnerable. As I expected, the presentations today have been terrific. I feel like our presenters took us around the world. And we do have a number of questions. I have to keep an eye on the time here. Let's see. Maybe we could go in reverse order a little bit here. So Berhane, here's one for you. How are government entities involved, if any, in the initiative?
Thank you, Erica. So government entities, the main government entity is the Ministry of Agriculture, both in Kenya and Uganda. And other entities are the national meteorological agencies who are responsible for generating climate information. So these 2 entities are part of the initiative. In fact, the technology that we have developed is already embedded at the government ministry, so that as soon as the government is ready to take it over, it would be automatically transitioned to the government. So there is also a strong capacity building component. And most of the time we work on secondment basis. There are government officers who work in the downscaling of information from regional to the hyper localizing it. So there is a steering committee that is chaired by government entities, so they are involved all the way from the generation of information to dissemination and supporting use, and also the policy integration part. It will be transitioned to those government entities. Sorry. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Let me, like I said, let me move to Dr. Shearer. Again, thank you for your presentation. You mentioned a hectare sending thousands of emails and that it's only going to increase. how are we realizing insights from all of this data? You mentioned AI and neural networks, but can you say a little bit more about how does that work, and what are the challenges?
Well, in North America, anyways, and a lot of Europe, we've entered an era of what we call prescriptive agriculture, and that is farmers don't go to the field until they have a map of how they're going to distribute inputs, and that's uploaded to the tractor, and then the tractor, using a GNSS receiver, queries that map and determines how inputs are going to be applied, whether they be fertilizer, seed, what have you, and across the landscape. What we're trying to do is do a much better job of matching, if you will, the inputs to the landscape, or even matching plant genetics. We have the ability, as we go across the field, to change the genetics of the crop being planted. So in one location, we might plant a more drought tolerant variety or hybrid of corn. In another location, maybe we plant a racehorse. But the analytics of the aggregated data is what is allowing us to generate those prescriptions. As we move forward, we're going to see that artificial intelligence take over in generating those prescriptions, as well as sensors on board the machine while it's in the field. And we're going to be processing that data and making decisions in near real time as well. So there's kind of an evolution going on right now. It started with building that database, but we're going to move from that data that's been aggregated using artificial intelligence to doing a much better job of managing our inputs for carbon sequestration, and if we look at CO2 emissions and a number of other things.
Amazing, thank you. There's also some economics questions, but I'll come back to you. I want to make sure I get to all of our speakers here. So Louise, towards the end of your presentation, you said, are we looking at the end of commodities? Can you say more about that?
Thanks. Yeah, that was a provocation, right? It's exactly, we're seeing in many services and products that they're becoming more and more decommodified, right? Before you get a taxi, and a taxi was taxi, it was a commodity product that would take you from A to B. But today, because of the algorithms, you can be matched with exactly the taxi driver that is closer to you and that has the best car that you want, right? I want a big car, I want a small car, and it gets much faster to you and much more adapt to your demands. So we see that on taxis, right, with Uber, etc. We see that happen in many other sectors. So it's hard to imagine that it's not going to happen in agriculture. Although agriculture is much more complex because it's a global traded and it's traditionally a very commoditized sector, right? It was a system that was built for efficiency, in which we trade a grain of corn no matter where it was produced, no matter how it was produced, because that standardization was very, very important for efficiency of the system, for price definitions, and for creating the global trade that we need. But with advances in technology, now I believe that it'll be more and more capable of saying, well, I want corn with X and Y categories on how they were produced. And I want corn that was produced in a different way, or I want soy or beef or palm oil that is different. We're already seeing that on this deforestation agenda. There are companies making commitments saying, I only want palm oil, which is no deforestation, which was not produced in deforested areas, right? And there are ways for you to actually differentiate those two products. And to me, that's just the beginning of the journey. It's going to happen with more sustainability requirements, and it's going to go into other non-environmental sustainability requirements. It's going to go into quality. It's going to go in a whole set of issues in which demand and supply for slightly different agricultural products are going to be matched much easier because of technology in an efficient way, so they can compete in the market.
Fascinating. And I had some additional questions about life cycle analysis and balancing these trade-offs of local farming and versus efficiencies of scale, and then the impacts on supply chains. But we'll hold on that because we have a few other questions. I want to be sure to get to as many as possible. This one I think perhaps is directed at Berhaim, but I'll pose it to the whole panel, and that is, how many farmers globally exist below the poverty level?
I think I don't have the statistics for that globally, but definitely it's different from country to country. In Uganda and in Kenya, about 80% of the population or the workforce depends on agriculture, and the below the absolute poverty line. Again, I don't have the exact percentage for both countries.
Mhm. Thank you, Berhane. Another question here, this one is for Dr. Shearer. All the data and data processing, as well as use of electronics and equipment, will also increase greenhouse gas emissions. Have you looked at the next, or at the net, I'm sorry, have you looked at the net greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah,
You
and
did
that's
speak
very
to
good.
carbon sequestration, but please, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. One of the things we know with data storage right now is the energy consumption is coming down. In other words, we're getting much more efficient at storing and managing data, and it has to do with miniaturization of a lot of the devices. It is a very valid concern. There is no question about that. When we look at a lot of these data storage locations, data warehouses, they are very energy intensive. There is no question about that. But again, I'm very heartened by when I look at some of the hard drive technology being employed in these, that cost is coming down. There still is an issue, though, that we have to aggregate that data and we have to move it to a central location. And again, one of the things that I want to come back to, and it's not so much a greenhouse gas issue quite as much, but it is that connectivity. And that's one of the things we have to look at the downside of not having the analytics when we're producing food, and thinking about how we manage our limited resources in those cases, whether it be water, nutrients, and things of that factor. So the person asking the question makes a very good point. We have to balance things, but we have to look at where we can basically experience, if you will, the savings or the reduction in greenhouse gases, and we have to balance those off in terms of the technologies we use. But a very good question.
Excellent question. Thank you. Well, this hour has gone by far too quickly. I want to thank you all for attending today's webinar, and thank you especially to our presenters for their time and insights. We look forward to continuing these conversations with all of you. Don't forget to register for our April 21 webinar, where we'll explore additional uses of drones. We touched on that today, but we'll take that a bit further on uses of drones for conservation. And please also consider submitting a nomination for GEC's Catalyst Award, where an esteemed panel of independent experts will recognize innovative technology that catalyzes sustainability globally. Since I have another minute here, let me just tell you a little bit more about the Catalyst Awards. We have two. The first is Catalyzing Impact at Scale, which recognizes organizations that have achieved a large-scale sustainability impact due to their design, manufacture, and/or use of IT. The second is Catalyzing Disruptive Innovation, which recognizes organizations that have designed cutting-edge technologies or used technology in such a way that, if adopted widely, could lead to exponential sustainability gains. The nomination process closes June 14th. It's open now, and there'll be an award ceremony this fall. You can find the nomination application form and supporting details on our website, www.globalelectronicscouncil.org, and just click on Get Involved. Thank you again, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.